Jack Calloway took a deep breath of the crisp morning air as he stood on the front porch of his farmhouse, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. The golden sunlight bathed the rolling fields in a soft glow, the distant sound of clucking chickens and the occasional bleat of a goat the only things breaking the silence. After 30 years of grinding through city life as an engineer in Seattle, this was exactly what he had dreamed of, a quiet, self-sufficient life away from traffic, meetings, and deadlines. Out here, things moved at a slower, more satisfying pace. He had no intention of bothering anyone, just growing his own food, raising a few animals, and living out his well-earned retirement in peace. But peace, as it turned out, wasn't on the menu. Not with Karen Whitmore around. The first time Jack heard her name was from the realtor who had sold him the farmhouse. Great property, perfect location, the man had assured him. Just one thing, you'll want to stay on the good side of the homeowners association. The president, Karen Whitmore, runs a tight ship. Jack had brushed off the comment at the time. After all, his property technically wasn't part of the Maplewood HOA. The farmhouse sat just outside the boundary line, and that had been part of its appeal, no overreaching rules, no neighborhood politics, just freedom. What he hadn't realized was that living outside the HOA didn't mean escaping its scrutiny. Karen Whitmore had ruled over Maplewood for 8 years like a self-appointed queen, patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on anyone who dared step out of line. Every lawn had to be perfectly edged, every front door painted in HOA-approved colors, and there was absolutely no deviation from her long list of regulations. Order and uniformity weren't just rules to her, they were sacred. And to Karen, Jack's farm was nothing less than a blight on her carefully curated kingdom. The first encounter happened just 2 days after Jack moved in. He was repairing a section of his wooden fence when a silver SUV pulled up in front of his property, tires crunching against the gravel. Out stepped a woman in her mid-50s, her blonde bob perfectly styled, a pastel cardigan draped over her shoulders like she was headed to a country club brunch instead of a confrontation. She carried an air of authority so thick it practically left footprints in the dirt. "Excuse me," she called, her voice sharp, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of him. "You must be new here." "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association." Jack wiped his hands on his jeans, giving her a polite nod. "Jack Calloway. What can I do for you?" Karen's lips thinned as she glanced past him, her gaze sweeping over his property like a drill sergeant inspecting an unkempt barracks. "I've already received multiple complaints about your setup." She gestured vaguely toward the goats grazing nearby, her nose wrinkling as if she had just caught a whiff of something foul. "This is a residential neighborhood. Livestock isn't permitted under HOA regulations." Jack took a slow sip of his coffee, unfazed. "That's interesting, considering I'm not part of the HOA." Karen's expression didn't waver. If anything, her lips pressed together even tighter. "Be that as it may, your farm is visible from Maplewood, and quite frankly, it's affecting the aesthetics of the neighborhood. We strive for a certain standard here, Mr. Calloway. Your animals don't exactly fit that standard." Jack fought the urge to laugh. "I appreciate your concern, but again, I'm not under HOA jurisdiction. My property, my rules." Karen exhaled sharply through her nose, her frustration barely concealed. "Well," she said, her tone clipped, "we'll see about that." She turned on her heel, marching back to her SUV, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the pavement. Jack watched her go, shaking his head with amusement. He had expected pushback from a few nosy neighbors, but this? It was almost comical. He figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. Jack didn't have to wait long to learn that Karen Whitmore wasn't the type to take no for an answer. Within days of their tense conversation, the consequences of standing his ground began to unfold. It started subtly. A few neighbors who had initially waved at him now averted their eyes when they passed his property. The friendly small talk he had enjoyed at the local grocery store turned stiffer, less inviting. He chalked it up to people being cautious, maybe a little unsure about the new guy in town. But then the official visits started. The first was animal control. A pair of uniformed officers knocked on his door one afternoon, clipboard in hand, stating that they had received multiple complaints about dangerous livestock wandering near the road. Jack chuckled at the absurdity of it. His goats were the most docile creatures he had ever raised, more interested in munching on grass than charging at pedestrians. He led the officers around his property, showing them the secure fencing and the well-maintained enclosures. They found no violations, offered an awkward apology, and left. Jack didn't think much of it at first, but then the county health inspector showed up, citing anonymous reports of unsanitary conditions. Again, after a thorough check, nothing was found. Then came the zoning officer, responding to claims of unpermitted structures. Jack saw the pattern before the third visit even ended. Karen was behind this. She wasn't coming after him directly, no, that would be too obvious. Instead, she was waging a war of bureaucracy, drowning him in inspections, hoping that at some point, something would stick. He started keeping meticulous records, documenting every visit, every baseless complaint, and every clean report that resulted from them. He even installed a set of security cameras along his property's perimeter after noticing a section of his fence mysteriously damaged one morning. Karen was relentless, but Jack wasn't backing down. The tension between them escalated when Jack got a surprise visit from Mark Holloway, one of the few neighbors who still treated him with decency. Mark was a laid-back guy, the type who spent his weekends grilling in his backyard and didn't seem particularly concerned with Maplewood's obsession with pristine uniformity. But that afternoon, he looked uneasy. "Hey, Jack," Mark said, scratching the back of his neck as he lingered on the porch. "Listen, I just wanted to clear something up. You know, about those complaints the HOA's been filing." Jack leaned against the doorframe, eyeing him curiously. "What about them?" Mark hesitated, lowering his voice. "Apparently, one of them came from me." Jack frowned. "And?" Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "I never filed a damn thing." Jack felt a slow burn of anger creep up his spine. "You're saying Karen put your name on a complaint without you knowing?" "Not just me," Mark said. "A few of us. I started asking around. Some of the guys on my street were surprised to find out they had reported you, too." Jack clenched his jaw. So that was Karen's game. She wasn't just rallying support against him, she was manufacturing it. He thanked Mark and wasted no time digging into the complaint records. Sure enough, half a dozen names were listed on various reports, all neighbors he had barely interacted with. When Jack confronted a few of them, the reaction was the same, confusion, followed by anger. No one liked being used as a pawn. Armed with this knowledge, Jack decided it was time to hit back. At the next HOA meeting, he walked through the doors of the Maplewood Community Center, his presence alone enough to earn a few surprised glances. Karen sat at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, her eyes narrowing slightly as he took a seat in the back. The meeting droned on with the usual HOA nonsense, discussions about lawn maintenance, mailbox uniformity, and the ever-important seasonal wreath regulations. But when the floor opened for new concerns, Jack stood up. "I'd like to bring up a topic," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Falsified complaints." The murmur that spread through the room was immediate. Karen's expression barely flickered. "Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly, "this is an HOA meeting. Since your property isn't part of our jurisdiction, I'm not sure this concerns." "Oh, I think it does," Jack interrupted. "Seeing as multiple complaints against my farm were submitted under the names of people who never actually filed them." He turned to Mark, who nodded in agreement. "Care to explain that, Karen?" Karen's lips tightened. "The HOA takes concerns about neighborhood standards very seriously. If complaints were filed, it was because residents voiced. I just said they didn't. Jack folded his arms. I have 3 people here who can confirm it. The murmurs grew louder. A few neighbors turned to each other, whispering. Karen's control over the room wavered for the first time. There must have been a clerical error, she said finally, her voice clipped. These things happen. Jack let out a short, humorless laugh. A clerical error that conveniently frames me as a neighborhood nuisance? That's quite the coincidence. Karen exhaled sharply through her nose, her irritation barely concealed. Mr. Calloway, if you have concerns, you're welcome to take them up with the proper authorities. Jack met her gaze, unflinching. Oh, don't worry. I intend to. He walked out of the meeting with a satisfied smirk, leaving Karen to sit in the fallout. He had exposed her tactics, and while it might not have been enough to bring her down yet, it was a crack in the perfect image she had spent years cultivating. But Karen wasn't finished. The next morning, when Jack stepped outside to check on his farm, something was wrong. His vegetable garden, his pride and joy, looked off. The leaves on his tomato plants were wilted, their stems curling inward. His lettuce, which had been thriving just days ago, was now yellowed and limp. Confused, he knelt down, brushing his fingers over the damp soil. It felt different, almost grainy. A sick feeling twisted in his gut. Someone had tampered with his crops. Jack's gaze lifted to the Maplewood neighborhood beyond his fence. He already knew who was responsible. That night, he repositioned one of his security cameras, angling it toward the garden. If Karen wanted a war, she had just made it personal. The following morning, Jack woke up before dawn, a habit he had developed since moving to the farm. As the first streaks of sunlight touched the horizon, he made his way outside, his boots crunching against the dirt path leading to his garden. He had barely taken 2 steps toward his crops when he froze. His gate, locked the night before, stood slightly ajar, the padlock dangling uselessly from the side. A fresh set of hoofprints and scattered chicken feathers led toward the road. His animals were loose. Jack sprinted toward the enclosures. The wooden latches that secured the goat pen were completely unlatched, swinging in the morning breeze. The chicken coop's wire door had been forced open, and feathers littered the ground in a chaotic mess. His heart pounded as he scanned the area. In the distance, he spotted 3 of his goats wandering near the main road. A sharp honk blared through the air as a passing car swerved to avoid them. Cursing under his breath, Jack grabbed a bucket of feed, shaking it to get their attention. The goats perked up at the sound, their ears twitching, and within minutes, he had managed to lure them back toward the pen. The chickens were more difficult, some had taken shelter in the bushes, and others had fled toward the neighbor's yard. By the time he secured the last one, sweat dampened the back of his shirt, and frustration burned hot in his chest. This wasn't an accident. Someone had let them out. And he had a damn good idea who. Jack stormed back toward his house and immediately checked the footage from the security cameras he had installed near the animal enclosures. His stomach tightened as the recording played. Just past midnight, a hooded figure crept into the frame, moving with a level of familiarity that sent his blood boiling. The figure approached the pens, hesitated for a moment, then methodically unlatched each one before slipping back into the shadows. Even in the grainy footage, the culprit's identity was unmistakable. Karen. Jack clenched his jaw. He had suspected her of poisoning his crops, but this was another level. She had deliberately endangered his animals, not to mention the safety of passing drivers. This wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. This was reckless. Dangerous. And he wasn't going to let her get away with it. Without hesitating, Jack picked up his phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into his driveway. Officer Ryan Caldwell, a man Jack had met a few times around town, stepped out, his expression serious but unreadable. "Morning, Jack," Caldwell greeted, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Heard you had a situation." Jack wasted no time. "I've got security footage of someone breaking onto my property and releasing my livestock. I want to file a report." Caldwell nodded. "Let's take a look." Jack led him inside and played the video, pausing at the clearest frame of Karen unlatching the pens. Caldwell exhaled through his nose, leaning closer. "That's quite the accusation," he said carefully, though his tone held no skepticism. "It's not an accusation. It's evidence," Jack said firmly. "And I want something done about it." Caldwell rubbed his chin. "I can file a report and have a word with her, but I'll be honest with you, she'll deny everything. Without a clearer shot of her face or a direct witness, this might not be enough for a trespassing charge." Jack exhaled sharply, knowing Caldwell was right. Karen was cunning. She'd feign ignorance, spin it as a misunderstanding, and somehow slither out of the consequences. But just as Caldwell was about to close his notepad, something on the screen caught his attention. "Hold on," he said, rewinding the footage. He pointed to a section in the background, barely visible in the shadows near the barn. "Who the hell is that?" Jack leaned in. His breath hitched. A second figure. Unlike Karen, this person was taller, dressed in all black, their face obscured. They weren't near the pens. They were near his barn, crouched low, fiddling with something. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they melted into the darkness, vanishing beyond the property line. Jack's pulse quickened. "That's not Karen." "No," Caldwell murmured. "And whoever they are, they weren't here to mess with your animals. They were doing something else." A chill ran down Jack's spine. His feud with Karen had consumed so much of his focus that he hadn't even considered the possibility of another threat lurking in the background. Caldwell straightened up, his demeanor shifting into something more serious. "Jack, have you noticed anything missing? Any signs of a break-in?" Jack shook his head. "Not that I've seen. Just the vandalism. The inspections. The sabotage." Caldwell scribbled something in his notepad. "I'm going to send this footage to our department for further analysis. If this person has been lurking around your property before, there's a good chance they'll show up again." Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration brewing beneath his skin. Karen was bad enough. But this? This was something else entirely. Caldwell snapped his notebook shut. "In the meantime, I'd suggest keeping those cameras rolling. And Jack, be careful." The officer stepped back toward his cruiser, but before getting in, he turned back with one last thought. "You said Karen's been making your life hell for weeks now. But looking at this, I gotta ask, what if she's not the only one watching?" Jack stood there long after the police car disappeared down the road, his fists clenched at his sides. He had moved to Maplewood for a quiet, peaceful life. Instead, he had just found himself in the middle of something far bigger than an HOA dispute. And for the first time, he wasn't sure who was the bigger threat, Karen Whitmore or the stranger lurking in the shadows. Jack barely slept that night. Every noise outside had his mind racing, every creak of the old farmhouse settling sent him reaching for the shotgun he kept under his bed. It wasn't just Karen anymore. That shadowed figure near his barn had shifted everything. Someone else had been on his property, lurking in the dark, doing God knows what. And that uncertainty gnawed at him. By sunrise, Jack had a plan. If Karen thought she could bully him out of town with her petty schemes, and if someone else thought they could sneak onto his land undetected, they were both about to learn that Jack Calloway wasn't the type to roll over and take it. He spent the morning reinforcing his fences, double-checking the locks on the animal pens, and reviewing every second of security footage he had. Nothing else suspicious appeared in the recordings, but that didn't make him feel any safer. Then, just before noon, another headache arrived, this time in the form of a county inspector, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. Jack met them at the gate, his stomach tightening at the clipboard in the inspector's hands. "Let me guess. Another anonymous complaint?" The inspector, a wiry man with thinning hair and a sour expression, cleared his throat. "Mr. Calloway, we've received reports that your property contains unauthorized structures that violate county zoning regulations." He gestured toward the barn and a small storage shed Jack had built last month. "We'll need to conduct an inspection." Jack folded his arms. "Funny. I already had a zoning inspector out here a few weeks ago. Found nothing wrong." The man barely blinked. "New complaints were filed. We have to follow up." Jack exhaled sharply, stepping aside, knowing full well how this worked. He had no doubt Karen was behind it, but fighting the county on this wouldn't get him anywhere. They moved through his property, scribbling notes, murmuring amongst themselves. Then one of the officers stopped near the shed, frowning. "Hey, take a look at this." Jack walked over, his patience running thin, until he saw what the officer was pointing at. A bundle of old, rusted pipes, stacked haphazardly behind the shed. Pipes he had never seen before. The inspector crouched, running a hand over the corroded metal. "This kind of material isn't permitted for residential use. Could pose an environmental hazard." Jack's jaw clenched. "That's not mine." The inspector barely acknowledged him, making a few quick notes before standing. "You'll receive a citation in the mail. If these aren't removed within 10 days, you'll be fined." Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't just Karen making complaints. She had planted evidence. She wasn't just trying to frustrate him, she was trying to destroy him. By the time the officials left, Jack was seeing red. He didn't even go inside. He went straight to his truck, climbed in, and drove straight into the heart of Maplewood. The HOA meeting was already in full swing when he arrived at the community center. He stormed through the doors, drawing every eye in the room. Karen was at the front, seated in her usual position of authority, clipboard in hand. Her expression flickered between mild surprise and annoyance. "Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly, "unless you've decided to formally join the HOA, I'm not sure why." Jack cut her off, voice cold. "Cut the act, Karen. I know what you did." A hush fell over the room. Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Jack took a slow, deliberate step forward. "The forged complaints? The trespassing? The poisoned crops? And now, planting illegal materials on my land just to get me fined?" His voice dropped lower. "That last one? That's criminal, Karen." The shift in the room was immediate. Whispers spread like wildfire. Karen's fingers tightened around her clipboard, but Jack wasn't done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, opening the security footage. Then, with the press of a button, he cast the video onto the large screen at the front of the room. The entire room watched as Karen Whitmore herself crept onto Jack's property in the dead of night, unlatching the animal pens. Then he played the second clip, her crouching near his crops, sprinkling something over the soil. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Karen's face went pale. One of the board members, Alan Brooks, turned toward her, his expression dark. "Karen, what the hell is this?" She floundered, her usual icy composure cracking. "This is taken out of context. I was only ensuring the neighborhood's safety. By poisoning a man's garden?" Mark Holloway scoffed from the crowd. "Or by faking complaints in our names? Because yeah, Karen, we know about that too." Karen looked around desperately, realizing too late that she had lost control. The board members murmured amongst themselves, and then Alan stood, rubbing a hand over his face. "This is a disaster," he muttered, before straightening. Karen Whitmore, effective immediately, you are removed as HOA president. We will be launching an internal review, and I highly suggest you find a good lawyer. The room erupted in whispers and gasps, some people shaking their heads in disbelief, others nodding in grim satisfaction. Karen sat frozen, her lips parting as if to argue, but for once in her life, she had nothing to say. Jack didn't wait to see the rest. He had won. But as he walked out of the meeting, his victory still fresh, something nagged at the back of his mind. Karen was finished, but who was the other person sneaking onto his property? Because he was sure of one thing now. Karen wasn't the only threat lurking in Maplewood. Jack had won the battle, but the war against Maplewood's corruption wasn't over. Karen Whitmore, once the untouchable queen of the HOA, had crumbled under the weight of her own deceit. Stripped of her title, disgraced in front of the very people she had controlled for years, she had no choice but to step down and disappear from the community she once ruled with an iron fist. Within days, a "for sale" sign appeared in her pristine front yard, and by the end of the month, she was gone. Word around town was that she had moved to a gated community with an even stricter HOA, a poetic twist of fate that made Jack chuckle every time he thought about it. But while Maplewood could finally breathe without Karen policing their every move, Jack wasn't celebrating just yet. A few weeks after Karen's downfall, Officer Ryan Caldwell pulled into Jack's driveway with a serious expression and a folder tucked under his arm. Inside were still images taken from Jack's security footage, the second figure, the one who had been near the barn that night. Caldwell's team had identified him. He wasn't just some petty vandal. He was part of a crew targeting rural properties, scouting for isolated homes with valuable equipment, tools, and livestock. Jack's footage had been the key to breaking open an investigation into a series of robberies in the area. His gut had been right all along. He hadn't just been dealing with Karen, someone else had been watching him, waiting. And if it weren't for his cameras, he might have been their next victim. For the first time in months, Jack felt something close to peace settling over his land. With Karen gone, the neighborhood transformed. What had once been a battleground of rigid rules and petty fines became a place where people actually talked to each other. Kids visited the farm, neighbors stopped by to buy fresh eggs, and Mark's son Ethan became Jack's right-hand man, helping out on the weekends. The farm, once labeled an eyesore, had become the heart of Maplewood's rebirth. But Jack knew one thing for certain: if Karen had never started her crusade against him, he might have never installed those cameras. He might have never caught the real threat lurking in the shadows. As he stood on his porch, watching the sunset spill golden light over his land, he smirked, raising his glass of iced tea in a quiet toast to the unexpected twists of life. He had come here looking for peace, and instead, he found himself in the middle of a war. But in the end, he hadn't just survived, he had won. The chickens clucked in agreement, as if they, too, knew that their kingdom was finally safe. But was it really over? Or was Maplewood just one bad neighbor away from slipping back into the chaos it had barely escaped? Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or a neighbor from hell? Share your story below, let's see who really had it worse.